It's launching. All right, guys, we are live. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I am Paige Gross. I am the Philly-based lead technically reporter. I'm gonna say hi in the chat to everybody who is tuning in, and I will give everybody a chance, everyone on the panel, a chance to introduce themselves and where they're based right now. And I would love to hear folks in the chat also drop where they're tuning in from today. So whether it be somewhere in the country, overseas, I would love to know. So Derek, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So Derek Siler, I'm a solution architect with Flexential, and I am out of the greater Philadelphia area, very close to Westchester University for folks that are in greater Philly and know that area. And work for Flexential, which is a provider of data center and managed cloud services for enterprise customers and their application environments.
Got it. Kevin, how about you?
Hi, good morning. My name is Kevin Benedicto. I'm a litigation associate at the law firm of Morgan, Lewis & Bockius. I do a lot of general litigation, but I'm particularly focused in our data privacy and cybersecurity group. I also work with our fintech group and our emerging markets to do work for startups. And I'm based in San Francisco.
So Kevin's graciously joined us very early in the morning. Andrea, how about you?
I'm Andrea DiGiacomo, the Chief Operating Officer at Thinksec. We are based in Baltimore, and we do cybersecurity, cloud, infrastructure management for organizations, mostly in the financial industries vertical. And I'm based in Baltimore, where we are.
And Isabelle?
Yes, I'm Isabelle Kent, and I'm the Executive Director of Philly Startup Leaders. We help out emerging startups here in the Philadelphia area and other entrepreneurs through mentorship, networking, events, education, and sometimes business grants, specifically for underserved founders. And of course, I'm located right here in Philadelphia, neighborhood-wise. I'm right on the cusp of Chinatown.
Nice, cool. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. I would love to keep seeing where everybody's logging in from this morning, because this session really is all about place and where local tech, communities and economies are going as we kind of enter an increasingly remote world. So we all heard, where our folks are working on the panel, but as we were chatting a little bit backstage, it sounds like everyone has been experiencing remote work for the last year or so, or maybe a little bit of a hybrid in recent months. So I'll start with a really broad question that was actually the subject of an Ask Me Anything session that we did in our public technically Slack, which is super broad. So it's okay if you don't have a super snappy answer, but do you think place matters right now? Like from where you are, where you're sitting, where you're working, is place super important to you in your work? And we can just do a jump in sort of situation.
This is Derek. I guess I'll lead us off then. Yeah, I don't think within the technology space, SaaS providers, folks that work in the application layer, place is terribly important, right? I think as opposed to maybe other industry verticals, we're pretty well integrated to working virtually and working in matrix team environments, right? I think the concept of place is interesting when you're talking about coming out of a post-COVID, though. Because speaking for Flexential and what we do, we handle a lot of customers that want to move out of their corporate data center environments, right? And what the COVID pandemic kind of showed us was that we could transition masses of white-collar workers into this remote work capacity and not lose a lot of productivity. In fact, not lose any productivity at all, right? So the teaming concept, the productivity concept held through COVID, even though we were all displaced and working remotely. So there's a lot of really really stuff coming out of analyst groups and so forth about as we transition out of COVID back into a central office capacity, are some of these larger corporate footprints going to contain or maintain their real estate holdings, right? Is their percentage of virtual employees going to grow from 5, 10, 15% to 40, 50%? So that kind of remains to be seen. I think some of the indicators are saying that there's not going to be quite as many people working in a central office kind of style as before COVID.
Yeah. Isabelle, I think this is kind of an interesting question for you as someone who's the leader of a place-based organization. So I know Philly's Startup Leaders has operated, virtually like everything else this past year, but it's as a community-based organization. I'm sure there's specific challenges versus just kind of being employees. So are you feeling like place matters?
It's a complicated question because to Derek's point, sometimes it matters based on your function, right? But I think overarchingly, it's more about the culture that you have in your company or what you're hoping to achieve. And I think there's a lot of personal preference involved as well. From our perspective as a community-based organization, I started in February. I've worked in Canada for the last 3 years while being based in Philly and worked remotely for 6 now total. And so for me, I don't think that it's necessarily it doesn't really make a huge impact. But for us as PSL, we do have some geographic limitations on who we serve. So depending on who's getting some of our grant programs, those are allocated based on the geography because they might be coming from a municipal or state partner. So in that regard, we do have to take geography into consideration. But on the other side of things, with the virtual event world, that's actually helped us engage our community on a much different level because it was hard throwing events downtown. And while we always had a great show historically with PSL, it was really limited to the folks that were already downtown, that were willing to stay after work, that were willing to come down. And that kind of alienated part of our community because overarchingly we serve, the western suburbs, Delaware, New Jersey, the northeastern suburbs as well. And now through virtual events, we're able to engage those folks more completely and invite them to join us for different types of programming. With our accelerator, this was the first year that it was fully remotely, and we actually saw that group thrive. So while we do want to have that in-person engagement, and of course you can't really beat that human connection on an in-person level, I've seen our community really do well with being remote, and I'm getting the sense that for the companies that we serve, there's certainly going to be a mix of what's right depending on their company culture and what their employees are wanting, but I don't think there's a one size fits all.
Yeah. I'm going to drop an article in the chat that our managing editor, Julie Beglin, wrote recently that kind of touches on this. But Andrea and Kevin, I'll give you guys an opportunity to talk about this if you'd like to.
Sure, absolutely. So for Thinksec, we've had employees all over the country pre-COVID. So we had, even though we're based in Baltimore, we've had fully remote workers as well as workers that would go to the office. What was really interesting actually at the beginning of COVID when we transitioned home was that the full-time remote workers actually enjoyed it more because they then felt that everybody was on the same playing ground. Previously, they might miss out on some of the water cooler conversations or, those more ad hoc collaborative sessions where now as we're all remote, right, we all have to call each other in some form. So I think that's been really interesting for our culture in a lot of ways. We are super collaborative and love working together as a team, and our culture is super important. So I think in a lot of ways that's made us stronger with the full-time remote folks in addition to our team in Baltimore. Additionally, our clients also are throughout the country, and we previously would go visit them on site, once or twice a year, have those personal connections at that time. And when we were supporting them or meeting with them virtually before, we might have been on video or using Teams or something like that, but our clients very rarely would be. Whereas now it is much more collaborative and they also are getting on video with us. So I think, regardless of where you are, this more virtual world has led to some of those more, better, stronger connections in different ways than when you were able to build them in person at the office.
Yeah. Before we hopped on live, I was hearing from Kevin that he had just done a couple of months of work on the DC schedule. So you're kind of a living example of this very remote situation. So what's that experience been like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways, I'll take it as the highest compliment when people forget that I'm in San Francisco and we'll like schedule a meeting that's at like 8 a.m. and then halfway through they're like, oh my God, it's at 5 a.m. where you are. I'm like, yeah, but that's okay. But like, I think that's what you want is a sort of seamless feel where a team can feel collaborative throughout. And I'll definitely echo what a lot of the other panelists said. Like, I think that place matters less. I mean, you know, in our practice is different because at some point there are courts that are located in physical locations that you'll need to sometimes go to either virtually or in person. But I think, like Andrea said, you know, we have offices and employees across the country. We have attorneys across the country, and our clients are disproportionately scattered about the country. So I think that you're seeing an ability to a real nimbleness, able to work in teams across there. I also do think there's a real benefit, like Andrea said, to the more pervasive culture of like video collaboration and things like that. Now, I know there are. That's especially true for some of our younger associates, where maybe before a client pitch, you would just have the one or two senior people go to that pitch, but now it's one big Zoom call. You're able to get more like virtual, face-to-face interaction. And start to get to know from the lawyer perspective, start to see your client's business and maybe some people on the business side that might skip out on the legal meetings and just let the lawyers handle it. Oh, it's I can just drop in, and I think you are seeing those strong connections get built that way.
Yeah, you make a good point, Kevin. I've heard a lot from a lot of people who, like Andrea was saying, were remote beforehand. Feel like the playing field is a little bit more level. And just like Isabelle said, you know, you can attend more events. I've heard folks saying I've gone out and fundraised, you know, my Series A completely virtually, whereas I used to be hopping on planes to do that. So it's obviously brought a level of accessibility to, you know, tech communities and saying like, if I'm based in Philly, that doesn't mean I can't fundraise out in Silicon Valley from my own home at this point. But it also definitely affects career trajectory. I think I've definitely heard from, especially like junior developers or someone who's brand new at a company saying, you know, this is not the same experience as going into the office, getting to know my coworkers. And, you know, a lot of the promotions from within happen because of those interpersonal kind of relationships and those moments of being able to like really show off your skills. A lot of that happens in person. So while remote work has given us a lot of accessibility, it also may have taken away some of those interpersonal relationships. So where do we think that, you know, remote work will always kind of look like it looks right now? Or do we see a more mix of hybrid work coming in where, you know, if you're newer at your company, you might want to come to the office 3 or 4 days a week to get to know people? Where do we think remote work and hybrid work stands once we're able to make those decisions free and clear?
This is Derek. I'll chime in. Yeah. So I think from the perspective of economics, you know, I don't think it's much of a decision, right? I mean, I think remote work and sort of the carrying costs associated with a lot of this corporate real estate holdings is more prohibitive versus less prohibitive. So if they have that determination, they're going to weigh on the side of my productivity is remaining strong, even though my workforce is primarily remote. So and from a productivity in terms of the tool sets, right? You know, what you need to do your job, that also held very well. You know, networks held well, the cloud held well, right? So all the things to remain productive in our jobs held through the pandemic, right? All you have to look at is, you know, large cloud players like Amazon and what's happened, you know, in the past year with that growth, right? And all the other hyperscalers. And we've experienced that as well at Flexential, right? As a lot of folks are looking to get out of their corporate data centers. So I think it's really going to come down to something much more interpersonal, right? In terms of how do, you know, workers feel about working remotely versus working in a true team environment in that classic sense of the word, where they're literally surrounded by their peers, right? What do they prefer, right? And there's probably an intergenerational answer to that. You know, I'm probably a little bit older than most of my fellow panelists on this panel, looking at everybody's faces here, but I'm a little more old school. I definitely prefer an office environment to go into. I would imagine, you know, a lot of the millennials would be much more comfortable, perhaps, in a much more remote or distributed. But I think it's going to come down to culture of the organization and where they find the most productivity, right? But there's not there's not an underlying sort of infrastructure component to it, right? Wherever you are, you're still going to be productive, and there's certainly not a financial component to it, because if anything, that would weigh itself more towards, let's not keep these large real estate holdings, let's make everybody distributed and make everyone's living room their office, right? So I think it's just going to come down to like the culture of the organization that folks are working for.
Yeah. Isabelle and Andrea, how are those conversations at your organizations going with hybrid work? Like, how are you guys making those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, well, PSL is a remote first organization to start with. We're a really lean team. So it's myself and 2 other resources, and then of course a very distributed board. And so for us internally, there's not really much of a change. We'll likely find a co-working space partner where we'll be working, and that'll be that. For the most part, I imagine I'll be at home or in the field. But I actually welcome having an office space to go to sometimes, because sometimes I am more productive, and having that change of scenery or being able to launch pad from somewhere in Philadelphia that is different than the neighborhood I live in is always a great option to have personally. But I think that, to your point, what we're seeing is that there's a lot of different conversations happening, because it's not just the variables surrounding remote work. There's a lot of conversations that are having about a new generation that's entering the workforce. To Derek's point, we're also seeing that there's this new wave of empathy that's coming into workplace culture in general about how are we accommodating people's lifestyles, and the fact that work-life balance really doesn't exist. It's kind of work intermingling with life. And that's probably going to continue to be the case. And we're seeing that embraced, especially with the younger generations, that we're acknowledging that you can't totally separate that. And so if that's going to be the case, then we want to have employers that are going to support us in the way that we like to work and provide other forms of benefits. And so those are sort of the things that I'm seeing are influencing the decisions to work remotely. And I do think that there's going to be a hybrid model. There's going to continue to be new tools. We haven't really seen what commercial real estate innovation looks like in the space. We haven't seen what the new trends are going to be with floor plans. And I think all of that will continue to change and iterate, especially over the next year or two, as we start really looking at what those sociological impacts are of COVID, and psychological impacts as well, because it's not just, well, do you want to work remotely or not? It's what are the other variables that are influencing your preferences? And also, how comfortable are we with being back in the office and being in close quarters with our colleagues? And is that a preference, and is it necessary? And I think that that's going to vary quite a lot depending on who you talk to.
Yeah. And I think for us, because we've always had remote workers, we will definitely still continue to be hybrid, more focusing on those Baltimore workers wanting to stay hybrid. And we're, in full support of that in terms of how our team can work most effectively together, or, when they're working individually. One of the biggest things, though, that we have had to adapt to is the onboarding and training component. So we have hired, just since COVID started, probably 8 or 10 employees, and we actually just got investment for the first time. So between now and the end of the year, we're going to be hiring another 6 or 8 employees as well. And that definitely was a learning curve in the beginning, to try to figure out, it's one thing to be in an office and have somebody, especially somebody who may be more junior, coming on board and saying, hey, come look at this on the computer screen with me, or hey, come jump on this conference call with me. Whereas now you have to be so much more intentional about those pieces and those components, and so much more planful. So that's really been something our team has been focusing on, is how to make that experience better. And should we anticipate that on-ramp taking a couple months longer potentially? And then additionally, going kind of fully embracing the how to continue to build our culture remotely, especially with new people again, right? It's very intimidating, I think, in a lot of ways, to be brand new in a virtual world when you're so used to being in person and making some of those small talk conversations. And that's how you get to know your coworkers. And again, we've had events that we do with our teams to get them to and get to know each other. And I saw the comment in that chat about having coworkers you've never met. it's very weird to me to not have met some of our coworkers in person. So we are looking at ways to get kind of creative too. And we have our main office in Baltimore, but we've also played around with the idea of, do we have some smaller offices? We have just coincidentally hired people in these little pockets around the country, Florida, Texas, California, West Coast. Do we do some, like we work co-working type spaces, once a quarter or once a month where people can fly in, or people that just happen to be in that region can get together. So we've played around with ideas like that. It's definitely evolving, kind of as I think we'll try different things too and see what works and what doesn't. I think that's one of the things about being remote is it gives you some of that more flexibility to try new things and see what the team adapts to and what they don't like as much, and pivot from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest uncertainty is that, like, there are so many questions around culture and around more junior people that we just don't know the answer to. And since we're all living this together, there's no one who's like a year in the future or 10 years in the future we can get their received wisdom on, because it's so unpredictable. I think it really is different for those of us who were established at organizations or further along in our careers, who when remote work happened, it was very popular because you could just maintain your connections while having this new flexibility. But I've heard from many people who are starting that it is really hard to start a career when all your professional networks are Zoom boxes. And I think for company culture, I think we just don't know the answer to how, again, when you're a large organization and you've added a handful of people who are learning through your corporate culture in a remote way is one thing, but as that becomes a larger percentage of your workforce, that becomes an even bigger question. And one that I think that the hybrid solution people are talking about doesn't necessarily work, because if you do, it's like optional 2 days, it's like less than the sum of its parts, because the people that are coming in aren't going to have, if the only people that are coming in are the new hires who want this connection, they won't have that mid-level or that senior person to grab coffee with. It's just going to be them confused together, which might be better than at home, but that's a real thing. That just because you've added it 2 or 3 days, I don't think is like, now we've solved 50% of our problem, because it's going to be exactly like it used to be those 2 days, and then exactly like remote used to be on the remote days. I think it ends up being a much more complicated question. And I also think it's a really tough space. We're here at Philly Tech Week for startups. I have a client who they were really just a co-founder pair before COVID hit. And even then, like, not a particularly close pair. And they've now staffed up. So their entire workforce has never met each other. They did all of their fundraising. They did all of their pitching, all remote. I think this Saturday, actually, they're all getting dinner based in New York, and they're going to meet each other for the first time, including their general counsel. It's unbelievable the fact that they went from seed all the way to functioning without ever, the founder maybe were in a room 3 times before lockdown hit, and that's an even harder question, because it's even harder than the question of maintaining a corporate culture you're very proud of in a remote environment. It's building one entirely from scratch in a remote environment, which is an order of magnitude harder.
Yeah. I totally agree with Kevin. I was lucky enough to have worked it technically for about a year before we had to go remote, but like some of my colleagues are saying in the chat, I have probably 3 or 4 colleagues I've never met in person. I think that's the same for a lot of people. And I've had friends start new jobs and they're like second guessing what that ellipses in Slack means, because they've never met that person and they don't know if that's like a ... You should understand what I'm implying here, or if it's just that you really love, punctuation. So it definitely is it's created a divide. But one thing I definitely want to talk about is the thought of being identifying with the place that your HQ is. So, all of our technically markets are based in a mid-Atlantic city. I'm a technically Philly reporter, but more and more we're having Philly-based companies who are hiring people from overseas, or who are hiring people from Baltimore or other, 2-hour away cities. So I'm curious, do you feel like it's important anymore to be a Philly-based company or a DC-based company? And actually, I'm going to drop a recent article on that in the chat. And I talked to a bunch of Philly CEOs and leaders, and they definitely had mixed feelings about it. So I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Some said
I'm happy.
super important, and some said, who cares?
I'm happy to take that to kick off that question because obviously we serve so many Philly-based companies. But what I've discovered is in getting to know the community a little bit more recently is that we also have a lot of like second HQs that are based here in Philly too. And I think that culture of the city that you're from is ultimately going to permeate your culture in general. I think that's going to be natural just based on who's going to start your company. But there's not been a better time to be a Philly-based company because you're now able to compete on a national and global level and still get access to the same resources. We are seeing investors from all over the country look at Philadelphia, invest in Philly companies. Fort Robotics obviously getting funded by Mark Cuban's grant, many other success stories like that more recently. And so I think that Philly's gotten validated in a way, but that inherent culture that Philadelphians carry with them, having that resilience, having that strong personality, not taking no for an answer, really understanding how to operate when folks are not giving you the credit that's due, that I think has been part of Philly culture for quite some time, and living in the shadow of these much larger cities, even though we ultimately had all the same resources, all the same talent, all the same quality of life, if not more, because quite frankly, it's a much less expensive city than DC and New York. And we're much more communal and neighborhood based. And so we have a small town culture like none other. And that certainly comes through in the way that the startups here are able to build their companies and collaborate. And that's always come through as well because we have a bit of a divide in who had access to tech talent over the last 10 years that I've been part of PSL in the community here, because it is competitive. Folks were leaving for a period of time and going to New York, but we're seeing that certainly change. And so I think that the companies here kind of got a head start on building really good company culture in the startup scene because they had to compete with the larger companies like Comcast and Aramark and the cities around us. And so that certainly has created a very different culture for a Philly type startup than what you're going to see in Silicon Valley or Austin. And I think it's a little bit more community oriented. It's a little bit more relaxed. And people really are gravitating towards the companies that are bringing them fulfillment versus just giving them employment. And that's just something that I've noticed. So I think that it's important to start your company in Philly if you want a little bit of that Philly ethos and personality in your brand. And I think that that's a wonderful thing to advocate.
Yeah.
I think being a Philly tech company is, important, or maybe being local to the community that you serve is important based upon, the products and services that you sell and your go-to-market approach, right? So, for Flexential, we have two sort of portfolio of services. We have cloud-based services, and when it comes to the cloud, customers care less and less where that physically is, right? Because there really is no cloud, or you're just renting someone else's computer, right? Yeah. But for the other side of our business, which is physical co-location, where it's, the client servers, and we're just providing the data center, raised floor environment, power and cooling for their equipment, it's extremely important. Right, so us being a Philadelphia-based company with a strong market presence here is extremely important to them because they're server huggers. They want to be able to come and see their infrastructure. They want to walk the raised floor. They want to know that there's when they check in, there's a guard there, and there's man traps, and there's it's a gated very secure facility in terms of what's protecting the crown jewels of their enterprise application environment, right? So I think in answer to your question, I think it really leverages or hinges very much on the type of product or service that they sell, right? And how hyper local their go-to-market approach is.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kevin, I'm interested in hearing your perspective from being in the Bay Area where, we had a couple of tech hubs around the country, and now, like we were saying earlier, it might be a little bit more of a even playing field about where folks might want to be located. So as someone in the Bay Area, what has the last year been like for you? Has it become is it decentralizing as a tech hub?
Yeah, I think you're definitely going to see, and already seeing, a lot of decentralization in the startup world, and even among established companies who are going increasingly remote. Salesforce has gone to an option where their employees can just be remote. So you have a lot of Bay Area anchors that are moving to a remote environment, and I think that has a tremendously diversifying effect on the entire industry. Like Isabelle said, whether it's access to funding or access to talent, and access to people who might not otherwise have had to want to bear the cost of living in the Bay Area. And I think that there are a lot of advantages there. And also, I think just the way a product is shaped is often shaped by, the team and the sort of preconceptions and lived experiences they have. And when the vast majority of your team are, of a single demographic in 3 zip codes around Silicon Valley, right, and then sometimes a secondary team based somewhere else, that inevitably influences the product. And so I think I'm very excited to see sort of the next wave of startups that are starting to get funding and that were built from teams that were from all around the country and built from teams with just different lived experiences. I think that's going to have a really tremendous long-term diversifying effect.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Andrea.
I was just going to say, for us, in Baltimore, it is a very, very competitive market for hiring highly skilled technical individuals. So some of our clients would ask, about our staff and where we're getting new talent from. And really ours came from a couple of different ways. And with this more acceptance of the hybrid environment, it gives us a much broader pool of really skilled individuals to pull from. So that has been really great for us on one hand. And then I think on the other side, we're really involved in the community. Our kind of tagline is people before tech, and that is really who we are through and through in terms of giving back to the community and wanting to see Baltimore be successful and help, get new folks into the tech industry who may not have had some of those opportunities before. So I think to us, our founders are from Baltimore. I think, personally, I love Baltimore. I have this sense of, kind of Baltimore pride. I think a little bit of wanting to see, successful startups coming from here. But I do think it also gives us the ability to have that broader impact and broader reach on various communities with having so many employees spread across the country. So really supporting them and them wanting to engage with their local communities has also been really neat for us, just on that expansion of impact.
Yeah. I think that's something that you all kind of touched on was just access to talent and kind of making that decision about we can now hire from outside of, the 45-minute commute that most people are willing to do out of any metro area. So that kind of brings up a point that I've been curious about, which is, for the last 100 years or so, most people had to make it to work every single day and had to commute there. So that really impacted where folks live. And that's how we ended up with, tech hubs in San Francisco, New York, Boston, et cetera. So do you think that this will change people's relation to living and working in the same space? I already know with remote work, obviously folks have moved closer to family or have been able to live out of a van and code on the side of the road, which is pretty cool. Do you think that this will continue, or do you think we'll get back to somewhere maybe in between of where we were and where we are now? Maybe we'll meet somewhere in the middle with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I read an article. I want to say it might have been Time or Newsweek or something like that about sort of the death of the mega city, if you will, right?
Yeah.
Because everything was so distributed. What was that going to do to Northern California and in the Ashburn, Virginia area, and kind of the major tech corridors, Austin and so forth, right? And because people could be so distributed in their work and stay productive, are you going to see growth in more remote areas of the country where people are looking for maybe a different lifestyle and living experience that's not as congested and cloistered as what they would get in a big city environment? I don't know. I mean, I'm still a little on the fence on that one. I think that there's going to be sort of a boomerang back where people are going to want to have that sense of community that they get out of their business tribe, right? And the more disparate and the more virtual that is, I think the more it tears at that cord a little bit, right? So I think it's going to come back a little bit as we start to get on the the right side of this pandemic and start to see our way through it. And I think the light is at the end of the tunnel now. But that's a huge prognostication, right? I mean, again, as far as the productivity tool sets we need, as far as the network tool sets, all of that stuff held. So it could go either way, and I don't think it's really going to hurt our economy broadly. But But I like the concept of, the big tech corridors and the emerging tech corridors, right? I would put Philly in that category. And I hope they sort of keep their cachet, right? And I hope they're able to kind of maintain that premium draw.
I also think because while your work is located somewhere, you also, I know a lot of tech folks participate in meetup groups, and you're going to monthly this or that. And so it might be that you work in Center City, but you also have a meetup at in Old City. And so there might be more than just that one tie to one location, somewhere in the city. It could be a lot of things. And community in general is not going away, whether that is work related or just you're liking your neighbors or having friends in the city, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, I also think it's one of those things that is not just happening sort of naturally, that there are smaller markets that are trying to encourage this. I just read an article about the sort of move by some small towns to do relocation bonuses. There's a town in West Virginia offering $18,000 for skilled workers to move there. In St. Clair, in Savannah, Georgia, and St. Clair, Michigan, there are $5,000 and $15,000 cash bonuses. So I think you will see. I think number one, it's such a fundamental shift. Like you said, it's been for as long as humans have been settling, we've been clustering in these hubs, and so we can't even predict what hybrid work's gonna look like 24 months from now, and try to think about what the next century of urban development looks like. But I think it is a really fundamental shift. I think you will see. I agree with Derek that I think that the large hubs won't go away, but I think the difference between them will shrink. I think that both in the sort of current wave of emerging tech markets like Philly and like Baltimore, I think you'll see them grow closer to the sort of traditional larger hubs. And I think you'll see a whole new tier from some of these towns that have success in encouraging redevelopment. If there's a burgeoning tech corridor in West Virginia or in Michigan, I think you'll see some of these efforts bear fruit and alter the landscape and sort of change that bar graph in terms of clustering of talent or impact.
I also just want to remind folks they can also drop specific questions if they have them in the chat. Andrea and Isabelle, is there anything that you wanted to add on that point?
Go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, I think, as you guys have said, Derek and Kevin, we are going to continue to see people moving out of those large cities. I think there definitely is a job satisfaction component to, that balance, right? We have a lot of individuals who they don't want to be living in cities, right? They want to go live in Oregon or some of these more rural areas where they can go camping or hiking or travel around. We had a guy travel around in a car for a couple of months pre-COVID, actually. And I think, there's that balance between having people in that close proximity, whether you're bringing them just together once a quarter or something, or they actually are living closer together. But having happier employees, I think, is such a big piece of having a great culture and having a successful company. If your employees are happy, they hopefully treat your clients better and they're happier, and it just leads to that more positive environment. I think it leads to less stress in some ways too. If your spouse has to relocate for their role, if you can just pick up and move with them and not have to worry about what you're going to do and those sorts of things, I think just the overall satisfaction for people in general, in some ways, I think would definitely continue to go up by having that flexibility.
Can I add just one other point? I think it's a good thing that the tech community isn't, sort of converged around Austin, Boston, and Northern California anymore. It's good that there's other growth corridors, right? I know this is Philly Tech Week, and so I won't mention too many other cities, but one of our fastest growing cities from a data center perspective is Portland, Oregon. Is Nashville, Tennessee, right? So there's tons of emerging tech corridors, and Philadelphia, right? There's tons of emerging tech corridors that I think will continue to grow and challenge the big three, where everybody thinks of, oh, you work in tech, well, you must live in Austin, Texas, or you must live in Boston, or you must live in Northern California, right? So I think that's a good thing, and I think a lot of communities like Philadelphia and others are just getting creative in the ways that they attract talent. To Kevin's point, right, about some compensation and bonuses and stuff to get that, because we're pretty blessed to work in an industry that's generally on the higher paying side of the pay scales, right? And so clearly these communities that want to grow want to bring our tax base into it. So it's interesting to see how they're being creative to sort of bring that talent on board.
Yeah.
So the one thing that I'll add to that is that it's not really a new concept. Reid Hoffman wrote Blitzscaling 2018, and he talks at length in that book rather early on about the fact that corridors for tech innovation are actually getting much more widespread, and that geography won't be tied to the Bay Area anymore. And of course, we saw that with Austin and other major cities that are actually quite smaller than Philadelphia. But we've also seen that really scatter. So to Derek's point, to Portland, to New Hampshire, to Indianapolis, just coming out of HR Tech myself, like a lot of the corridors for that sort of innovation were much smaller cities. And I think that now that investors are seeing that they don't need to have startups in their own backyard to have that control, to have that guidance that they're able to offer them, and now that they're shifting their perception, early stage startups are getting much more of the support that they need. I was having a conversation with the Techstars team in Buffalo, New York, and they actually have a ton of innovation and very successful high growth companies that are located in that otherwise very small city. And so I don't think that necessarily that's anything new. I think that the optics and the perceptions are changing because folks have kind of drop down what they think a Manhattan address means, right? And so while there's certainly companies that are still going to value the optics of having a certain geographic location, I think that now you have access to talent through remote work, you have access to resources, to support funding, to whatever it is that you need to actually grow. And people are getting much more creative because ultimately great ideas come from anywhere. And I think especially now that we're going into a period of innovation where things are going to be vastly different. It's not the next progression of a certain industry. It's an entirely new category that's going to be developed in any plethora of areas. And so those ideas have to come from non-traditional hubs, non-traditional locales, and non-traditional founders in that sense, because that's really where you're going to get different ideas. But also when you look at Philadelphia, it's not like innovation is something new here. We've had $100 million exits 30 years ago, 50 years ago. And so we've always been an innovation hub. We've just been a bit quiet about it. And so I think that now we're seeing the people that are getting involved in conversations are being more representative of a much larger geographic cross-section.
Yeah. We only have a couple minutes left, so I kind of want to wrap it up with this question, which is, we've seen how no matter what you plan for, no matter what your plans are, your intentions are, a global pandemic can really just throw it all out the window. And we've had to adapt. So I think, like myself personally, people I talk to have stopped necessarily saying, okay, I have a 20-year plan, because who knows how that's going to go. What are some of the things that you either personally or in your work life have kind of learned about during this time that you're going to continue implementing, whether it be like, I like working from home, or I like the ability to have a doctor's appointment at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and just come back, or whatever it is. So what have you taken from this time that you're definitely going to implement, even if, real life can return and you don't have to do those things anymore?
Well, you mentioned this earlier. I feel like if my Instagram ads are any indication, we're all going to be living in vans soon, because I feel like half of my Instagram ads are people living their best life in a van. But I think for myself personally and for organizations, I think a big takeaway really is, and a big differentiator between those, again, individuals and companies that did well versus didn't, is really that nimbleness and that flexibility and that adaptability, the sort of willingness to discard your preconceptions and say, when you were really an advocate for office culture in the office, and realizing quickly that you need to be able to pivot to a really collaborative work environment, or you need to be able to, work from another city, and you need to be able to change maybe long held life plans on a really short amount of time. And I think that a key differentiator between those who thrived and were able to succeed in the pandemic is being willing to recognize when it's time to sort of change your game plan and throw it out, and not necessarily be so defined by it. So I think that's something that I know that the client organizations have taken. That's something that I've taken from it personally is be willing to just kind of rip up the playbook and start from scratch. Times when you do, you learn something really new and are able to benefit.
Agree.
Yeah, very similar takeaway. You know, it's important to have maybe a direction that you want to go in or have a loose plan, but also be very malleable to change and really develop that resilience in yourself so that way you are able to weather the storm, because ultimately, especially when you're in innovation, that's going to keep happening at a much faster rate than what I think we've seen in previous years, that the world just changes at a rapid rate. And we have to be open-minded and continue to work towards, you know, whatever that new trajectory or whatever that new impact is going to be. But I think for me, especially, it's kind of solidified the need to be involved in your community, in your own backyard, being aware of what's going on in your city on a social level, political level, you know, from a business perspective, and really understanding what's happening in your own backyard. Because ultimately, if we do have another pandemic, you're going to be spending a lot more time here. You're going to be more involved. And also the community around you is going to have a lot more impact on your own well-being. And so being involved and having a say in that process, I think, is just so much more important than it has ever been, to just be a good steward of your own communities and ensure that you're living in a place that that feels right and it feels like home. And if there's something that is not right, that you're getting involved in ensuring that it's moving in the right direction.
I would add, you know, just learn to be good stewards of our time, right? I think we survived this pandemic. A lot of us had to adapt. You know, a lot of us have kids, you know, working remotely and also doing distance learning. So it's been immensely challenging for not just office workers, but, you know, many of these office workers are moms and dads, right? So I think, you know, what I hope to carry out of it is just an understanding of how to be, you know, prudent and judicial with my time, right? And making sure that I'm putting it towards things that help the company that I work for, and then help my individual skill sets, so I can continue to advance my career.
And I'll just add too, I definitely agree with everything you guys have shared. And then one additional thing is just taking care of yourself and your family. I've definitely seen, you know, from our team and more broadly, that people are being more intentional with their time and not having to go. I would drive downtown to Baltimore and it would take me an hour each way. And knowing now that I can get up at the same time and take my dog for a walk, and I'm healthy and getting fresh air and they're happy, and you know, there's ways to do more with your time in better used ways, or, you know, spending time with kids, or being more flexible during the day. We have an employee whose kid today is getting inducted into an honor society, and he's taking, you know, an hour during the day, where I don't know if before you know, being remote, that, you know, you would have had to leave the office, or thought you would have had this perception of like, oh man, I got to leave the office and I got to go take time and this and that. Whereas I think now people have figured out that they can take really good care of themselves and their families, and prioritize that, I think, more than they have previously, or thought that they could previously.
Yeah. Well, that's a great note to end on. I want to thank everybody so much for joining us for this panel. And I think this is a conversation that will continue even as, you know, regulations are lifted, capacity limits, whatever. I think we'll be having this conversation for many years to come. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining. And I'm going to send you off to the next session. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Everyone, thank you.